Hello, and welcome back to Dr. Hollowed. I'm John. In today's episode, we're going to dive into the world of graveyard shift workers and the creepiest, most unexplainable things that they've experienced while on shift. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Give the video a like when you enjoy.
I work midnights at a hotel and have experienced a few weird things, and others that have had the shift have experienced unexplained things as well. We lock all the doors after a certain time, and these experiences have all happened after we have had the doors locked. I have had cabinet drawers opened by themselves. When I'm not around, I have heard footsteps, and I frequently get the feeling I'm being watched. The craziest experience I've had occurred just a couple of weeks ago. There is an automatic paper towel dispenser in the restroom on the opposite side of the restroom, visible in the mirror. I was washing my hands and heard the paper towel dispenser activate, so I quickly turned around to see it dispensing a paper towel on its own. After it finished dispensing the paper towel, as I was watching, the paper towel lifted up from the bottom and stayed upwards for a few seconds, then dropped limp. There were no air vents on that side of the restroom near the paper towel dispenser. It gave me chills, but it was interesting to experience. My brother is a late-night janitor at an elementary school. He said he was alone, watching YouTube videos with headphones on, in a dark office toward the end of his shift, when suddenly a kid loudly asked him to clean my bench. Startled, my brother searched for the kid, replayed the video he was watching, and was stumped when he didn't come up with anything or anyone. He remembered that there was a memorial bench for a boy who was hit by a car and killed a year or so prior, and so he went outside and made sure it was tidy. He felt better but was still obviously shaken. The deceased kid's sister goes to school there to this day, and my brother knows his family and sees the boy's mom often. I asked him if he ever told the mom about it, and he said no, he just makes sure the bench is spotless. I worked at a 60-year-old military facility. I once went walkabout to keep the sleepies at bay and saw a guy wearing BDUs down the passageway, so I hopped to call the guy out for wearing a phased-out uniform, which had been phased out by 2 to 3 years at the time but had been worn for quite a while. As I pick up pace to pursue him, he picks up pace as well. Seeing as I was a newly minted NCO, I take the challenge and got pissed. So I sprint to follow him, and around a corner we go. And nothing, no one is there. It's super weird. The only way out of this passageway is what we call the tunnel, some contingency tunnel for evacuation. This tunnel had been welded shut not too long ago. I'm stumped. To this day, I don't know how the F some dude got into the building by a guard wearing an out-of-circulation uniform, then how he disappeared into thin air. My best guess is that it's a ghost. But it's still bothering me years later. I have worked night shifts for 15 of my 18 years in medicine. I've worked in all kinds of facilities. There are quite a few stories from all of these years, but this one happened a few years ago. We had a patient who was dying. She was Native American, and her family asked if we could open the window so her spirit could exit. My charge nurse and I apologized profusely and explained that it was not possible as the windows don't open at all. The lady passed away a few hours later. A few days later, I was sitting at the desk across from the room, and I was expecting a patient, so I had the room set up and ready to go. We had a slide board on the bed. It's a long plastic board used to help slide patients from one bed to another. Anyway, as I'm sitting there, I see the slide board fly off the bed and hit the wall. No one was in the room, and I was the only person near the room, but I was still easily 20 plus feet away from the door to the room. I went in and picked up the board and said, "April, you're dead. You have to move on." We had a few more things happen, like the heart monitor showing the heart rhythm of a dying patient when no one was in there. Every time, I just go in there and tell her she's dead. Eventually it stopped happening, so I hope she finally found her way out. I used to work at an animal shelter, and one day I came in for an overnight to monitor a few big litters of sick cats that came in. The shelter basically had 2 really long hallways, one for the public to view animals and one for the offices and surgery wing. I was doing miscellaneous cleaning duties in between medicating the cats, and I heard meowing down in the surgery wing. So I walked down there, thinking there was a cat spending the night in the surgery kennels that needed water or something. Nope, no animals were there. So I just assumed it was a cat somewhere else, and I just thought it came from the vet wing. About an hour later, I was sitting down with the kittens, syringe feeding them, and a black cat walked by the door. I figured it was just one from another room that got out, and it couldn't harm anything to let it explore the shelter for a bit. After feeding, I went to find its kennel, so I knew where it went when I found it, but no kennels were empty. This is where I started to get creeped out. I saw the cat towards the end of the hall watching me, so I went to grab it to bring it to a kennel, but it disappeared almost out of thin air. I pretty much just tried to pretend it didn't happen because, after all, it's just a cat, and it seemed friendly anyway. The next morning, I mentioned it to the vet on staff, and she said, "Oh, that's just Shadow. He died during emergency surgery a few years ago, and he still wanders around sometimes." Whether or not it's true, it was still insanely creepy. I worked at Kohls for a few years. I would work overnight doing clearance. We think the men's section was haunted. I would call him Robert. I have no idea why. One day, I was working in the men's section by myself. I kept stacking these boxes. They weren't towers. Most of them were 2 or 3, and they were wide boxes. So I'm sitting there, printing clearance labels and listening to my music, nowhere near the boxes, and they kept being knocked over. Eventually, I just say, "Robert, I'm here by myself, so stop it." It didn't happen again, but I always said something to him before I would work in his section. I work at a 24-hour restaurant, and at night there's only 2 people, the server and kitchen worker, until 7 a.m. one night. It was around 2:30, maybe 3. I finished all of my cleaning duties and was fucking around on my phone, eating some pancakes. The kitchen person goes into the bathroom, so it's just me in the dining room. I hear someone call my name from the back, and I thought the kitchen person snuck past me and needed help. Check around, and no one's there. A bunch of pans fall off a shelf that I can't reach. I'm 5 feet 0 inches. The shelves were a good foot higher than I could reach, and the sink turns on full blast, and I hear laughing. I say, "Fuck this, take my pancakes outside, and just smoke until 7. My manager didn't believe me, but I refused to ever work a night shift there again. I work for an ambulance company, and my shift is 1900 to 0700. So between calls, we post in certain areas throughout our coverage. So we get posted to a usual area, and we know of some quiet areas. This parking spot we have is at the end of a street where a housing complex was being built, but it is no longer active. Keep in mind that this street is extremely difficult to stumble upon. You kind of have to know where it is to find it. So we back in like usual just in case we have a call, and about 45 minutes pass and we notice a 4-door sedan come driving up the street. Immediately lock the doors because it's only us out here, and this car does a U-turn in front of us. Cool, they're leaving. Nope, they put it in reverse and it back up to our right-hand side. At this point, I have the radio in my hand, waiting for SHT to go down. Not to bring race into the picture, but now 4 Mexican guys aged mid-20 get out and start taking pictures of our ambo from all angles, and I ever hit them with the floodlights to deter them, and they were unfazed by it. After about 10 pictures overall, they all just got back in the car and drove off. To this day, I have no idea what it was about. I work nights at a taxi office located in a very old office with a mechanic's garage attached to the building. Some people say a man hanged himself in the garage, but I've never seen any proof of that, but whatever. I do 100% believe that the last manager died in his office here, though. Things happen all the time. The kettle and microwave turn themselves on, the clock has fallen off the wall a few times, the hand dryer in the bathroom comes on when I'm on my own in the office, and I can hear it. The creepiest thing to happen was this. Where I sit in my office, I can see out of the door, right down a corridor. The floor is tiled, and the doors squeak like hell when they open. I was just sitting there watching a film or doing my work one night and hearing a noise getting louder, so I looked over my computer down the corridor, and a single silver ball bearing was just rolling down the corridor towards me. I picked it up and put it in my pocket. I'm a cop. There's a wooded area in my city that sits on top of a mountain. There's a clearing in the woods that opens up to a sheer cliff face overlooking the next town over. When I was growing up, it was a popular place for kids to go and hang out, drink, have bonfires, that sort of thing. We called it Recreation Point. Several people died there over the years. Some jumped, and some just drunkenly stumbled over the edge. A few years ago, whoever owned Recreation Point sold the land to a real estate developer who cleared out most of the woods and turned it into an upscale mountaintop housing development. The area leading up to the cliff is still wooded, and the trail is still there. One night at work, I was bored and feeling nostalgic, so I decided to go check out Recreation Point. I hadn't been there since high school, so I figured I'd go have a look under the guise of looking for trespassers. The woods start at the very back of the neighborhood. I parked at the back of the neighborhood and started to walk through the woods toward the cliff. At the time, the neighborhood was still under construction, and there were no finished houses anywhere near the woods yet. There were no cars parked anywhere close to the woods, and this neighborhood is on top of a very sparsely populated mountain that's not really within walking distance of anything. Since I didn't see cars nearby, I was fairly certain that I wasn't going to run into anyone in the woods. That is, until I started hearing voices in the distance. I could hear two distinct voices. One male, one female. I was a bit too far away to make out what they were saying, but they were clearly voices. They sounded like they were coming from the clearing. Probably some kids up there hanging out, I thought. I'd just tell them to leave and be done with it. The woods and the darkness were still blocking my view of the clearing, but it was obvious that's where they were coming from. I got closer to the clearing, and the voices got louder. I finally made my way to the end of the trail, into the clearing, and silence. The second I stepped into the clearing, the voices stopped. There is one trail leading in and out of that clearing, and I was on it. The only other way out of there is to go loudly stomping through the thick underbrush. Or over the cliff. It was a quiet night, I would have heard them if they had darted into the woods. I looked around, made absolutely sure there was no one hiding in the clearing, and decided that this was not a place where I wanted to be. I made my way back down the trail toward my car, moving faster than I'm comfortable admitting. I don't scare easily, but that had the hairs on my neck standing up. Especially when I heard the voices start again, coming from the clearing behind me. I don't believe in ghosts. Logically, I know that it was probably my ears playing tricks on me, or birds, or sound carrying from a house in the distance. Some rational explanation. But I know what I heard, and I know it completely stopped the instant I set foot in the clearing. I don't know. Kinda weird. I worked in an overnight pharmacy. Most of my time was spent reading, but this one night we had a really fucking old guy come in around 1 a.m. He comes up to the register I'm at and asks, "Hey, is it okay if I just hang out until my friends get here?" I reply, "Sure, man, we have chairs over there if you would like to sit in them." "Where is your friend coming from?" He chuckles and says, "New York City. He left about 15 minutes ago. Roughly a 12-hour drive." I reply, "Oh man, well, you can sit in here until he gets here. No one will bother you. Got about an 11-hour wait, I suppose?" He chuckles again and says, "Nah, let's just say. We can get around a lot faster than most. Hee hee hee." This guy was dressed in a brown suit. He looked like he walked out of the 1950s. The suit had to cost at least $500, but it looked more like it cost $2,000. I can't even describe how he talks or acts. He would stare at me with incredible intent while speaking, his eyes as wide as he could hold them open the entire time. He spoke in these really monotone, broken sentences, and on top of all of that, he walked really funny. He winds up walking around, telling me that he's going to get trinkets from my state. About 30 minutes later, he comes up to me with his cart full of the most random SHT I've ever seen. It's all food, books, and electronics. Nothing would signify that he was ever in my state. Stuff you could buy anywhere in the US. He asks me if it's okay that he parks his cart beside the counter for me to watch while he goes outside. I say, "Yeah, that's fine." He goes outside. About 30 minutes pass, and another customer walks in and tells me that a guy is outside who's creeping him out really bad. I go out, and it's him. He's sitting on this bench in a crouching position. Keep in mind that this guy looks like he's in his upper 90s. He sees me, and he says, "You told me it would be okay if I waited here." "Yeah, I did. You okay?" He replies, "Yes, why wouldn't I be?" When I don't respond and walk back in, he keeps asking what he would be doing that was out of the ordinary. No anger, no emotion, nothing. He asks again, and I say, "Well, sitting like that is strange." At which point he stands up and just keeps looking at the bench, really confused. I go back inside. Around 20 minutes after that, a black guy in a onesie with light-up shoes comes in. This guy looks like he's in his 20s. He comes in singing, skipping around the store, and walks up to the counter and says, "Hey, have you seen my friend? He should be around here somewhere." His voice sounds ultra friendly. He's way too friendly and happy, the whole time. He's got a smile on his lips, but it's not showing on the rest of his face. As he was looking at what appeared to be his phone, he was shielding me from my sight with his body, apparently on purpose, because when I tried to look around him, he moved in my way. I respond, "What does your friend look like?" He, for the first time, stopped and said, "Well, I'm not sure. I just got down from NY, I left an hour or two ago." I said, "Brown suit? Older white guy?" He doesn't respond, looking a bit confused. An old white guy walks in, and they see each other and hug, and I couldn't make this shit up. start dancing with each other in a really strange fashion. The black guy gets some beer from the back, shouting at the guy in the brown suit, "Give me 1 second, let me get some drinks for the flea, a road." Giving me a strange look. He pays with a credit card that's totally blank other than the black bar on the back. They crack open a few beers and walk out of the store, sucking them down as fast as they can. I just don't fucking know. Did I meet aliens? What the fuck? For several months, the psychiatric hospital I worked at picked up 2 night shifts a week on top of my 5 regular shifts, and nothing really weird happened other than a patient occasionally calling out in their sleep. However, when I was training, another staff member who was also new asked the instructor, "What's the craziest thing that's happened since you've worked here?" And she thought about it for a few minutes and replied, "I was working 3rd shift, graveyard, one night in the old building, and we had a roach problem at the time. I was sitting in the corner of a patient's room doing a cost shift, close observation while sleeping for high-risk patients, and I heard a skittering on the floor. All of a sudden, the girl, who is dead asleep, gets out of bed and walks into the hall. She picks up a roach off the ground and eats it, then returns to bed as if nothing had happened. The staff member doing hallway observation and I kept having to check in with each other to make sure we weren't hallucinating, but we both saw it. That other staff member moved to medical records, and one day I saw her and asked about it. She turned pale and looked like she'd seen a ghost, and she said, "WH, who told you about that night?" I worked overnight at a McDonald's and was relatively dead most of the night except when the bars closed. An hour or so after the bar rush, some dude pulled up to the drive-thru window and just sat in his car, looking directly forward with his hands on the steering wheel. He sat there for a few minutes without responding to the person in the drive-thru. They said they were going to call the cops, so he drove away and pulled into the parking lot, and then just sat there in his car looking at the drive-thru. After about 10 minutes, he left. Or so we thought. The next thing we see is his guy standing in the drive-thru lane, looking directly at the security camera with a blank expression on his face. We weren't allowed to open the door to the building after the lobby was closed, so the manager called the cops, but before they arrived, this guy walked backwards away from the camera, got into his car, drove around the building, pulled up to the drive-thru window, smiled at the drive-thru person, and then left. It was creepy as hell, and I swear I saw this guy again a short time later with his family in the car, and he was acting completely normal. Maybe he was on drugs or something. I have seen some shit. Overnight shift at 7 to 11 in the middle of Nowheresville. It was often so slow that I would go sit in my car and read, drink, or both. It would get super busy at 5 a.m. with commuter traffic, but till then, nothing. I could do all the work in about an hour and a half, the rest of the time was just dead. Let's start with the robbery. I was in my car reading Cherry or Blacktail and sipping from a flask, listening to music. And I see a customer walking towards the store from across the parking lot. He walked to the window and looked in, and I got out of my car to follow him into the store. While I was behind him, he pulled on a ski mask, and at about the same time, I announced my presence. He freaked out and ran off. I went inside and called the cops. They showed up about an hour later and took a report. Not crazy, but definitely odd. The commuter lot, guys. 100 or so yards away was a commuter parking lot. In said lot were vans to take people to DC. Some smart drivers of these vans had left the keys in the gas cap area of the vans. So 2 teenagers had taken a few of the vans and were playing bumper cars with them in the parking lot. They rolled one of the vans and basically crushed the kid's arms. It was definitely broken, and it was bleeding everywhere. They walked in and headed towards the bathroom, leaving a trail of blood on my nice white floors. WTF. They leave without any other incident other than fucking blood everywhere and a few sets of keys tossed in the toilet. I grab a mop, clean shit, and start mopping up blood. One of the guys runs in, grabs 2 cases of beer, and runs out. I call the cops. 2 hours later, they come by and take a report and the keys. The huffer. I'm sitting inside, counting cartons of smoke and sandwiches, and looking up at the gas pumps because someone has activated a pump and needed to be approved. Just a guy on foot. No car, no bike, just a guy. Okay, whatever. Approved. Get your fuel. Back to counting. I look out, and he has dispensed the gas into a rag and is sitting at the pumps, sniffing the shit out of it. A fucking gas-soaked rag was over his face. Really, dude? He passes out and starts fishing all over the ground. I go outside. He has pissed himself, laying on the greasy concrete. His eyes rolled into his head, twitching. His hand is clamped to that rag, though. I won't let it go. He comes to it and wanders off. I know he went into the local trees to huff on that rag some more. I call an ambulance. They are there in 5 minutes. I point to the woods, and they go in after him. Those are the three that come to mind. But there were more. Really old men cross-dressing, couples doing ecstasy and asking me to join them in back, hookers selling perfume, people stealing gas repeatedly, and dozens of drunk people stories. I was a camp counselor at a place for 4th, 6th graders in Arizona over the summer. I often had to stay up most of the night to make sure the kids were in their bunks and safe and everything. The camp was up in the woods. Yes, northern Arizona has trees, so I was mostly just making sure javelina didn't sneak into any of the cabins or that the kids weren't dumb and walked out into the woods in the middle of the night. So one night at about 1 in the morning, after a few nights of not really sleeping, I was too tired to stay awake. I made one more round, so I knew the kids were all asleep, and then I headed to my bunk to get some rest. We each had these wooden cabins, not too big and no air conditioning, which meant opening the windows, but it was a place to sleep. Anyway, it was a pretty restless night. I woke up a couple of times, and one of the times I woke up sitting up in bed, which I thought was odd. Considering how tired I was, I thought I would have been out until morning. When I was finally up for good, I felt pretty groggy. I went straight to the shower, got it hot as it would go, and got in. I opened my eyes after standing in the water for a few seconds, and there was blood dripping from my face. I looked down, and there was blood everywhere. It was all over the shower tile, and it was all coming from me. I figured it out as I ran out and looked in the mirror. It was all dry, but all over my face. All down my chest. Practically covering my hands and arms. I was terrified. From what I could tell, there were no cuts or scrapes anywhere on my body, and the blood looked like it had started around my mouth, but there were no cuts. It was all in my teeth and beard, and there was no sign of where it came from. And it was definitely blood. I've hurt myself enough to know the metallic taste. I got back in the shower, got it all off of me, and went back out to my bed to see if it was in the sheets. And to my surprise, it wasn't really. Sure, there was some, but if I had blood coming out of me, it should have been all over the bed, right? Nothing. It's like it was already dry on me when I got in bed. The worst part was right after. I looked at the window my bed was in front of, and there was a red-blooded streak that was definitely not there the day before. On the outside of the window. One of my buddies walked in and saw the look on my face and asked what was wrong. I told him the story, and he got freaked out and was wondering if I went out in the middle of the night and ripped apart a javelina and ate it. I told him that he was disgusting, and I'd never rip anything apart, much less eat it. To this day, I have no idea what happened. I have spent the majority of my 6 years in security working graveyards, so I have seen some strange shit. The biggest was when I worked in security at a chemistry graduate school. I was sitting at the desk, keeping an eye on things, when suddenly, on camera, I saw a guy with a crazy hobo beard and wearing no shirt and camo pants walking down the hallway of the lab building, which you can only get into via keycard. I called for backup from another guard and then confronted him. We asked him basic questions, and not for one moment was he ever hostile or angry, but at the same time I had that chill up my spine that something was wrong with this guy. Eventually, we escort him out of the building and see him walk into the wooded area near the school. My fellow guard and I called the police, who proceeded to go into the wooded area and arrest him. The police proceed to find on him 2 army belts strapped to his thigh that he could pull out at any time due to having taken out the pockets in his pants, a gun, backpacks belonging to students of the lab, which is how he got into the building as one of them had stolen them just a few hours before, and other items from the buildings. The creepiest part was that the guy had a notebook with information collected about all the guards and how, if he needed to, what he would do to take us down if we got in his way. In fact, I was told I was smart to call my fellow security guard when I confronted the guy because he was armed with his pistol that night, which probably deterred the homeless man from possibly doing anything. Especially since I found out shortly that Mr. Homeless Man was wanted for the murder of 2 people in Oregon 6 months earlier. I spent the rest of my 4 months on site, always having eyes in the back of my head and my ears wide open. Work a night shift at a jail. Apart from the obvious case of crazy inmates acting possessed, I've heard of the stories about it being haunted. Apparently, a few years ago, a paranormal investigation team came and said there was a presence. They used to hang people here and everywhere. I believe in ghosts but have never seen or heard anything, so I thought I'd be fine. I was sitting at the CO desk one night, and behind me were the showers. I heard something in the shower, like a chair or something being dragged on the floor. There are no chairs in the shower, and nothing can fit in there except for one person standing. All the inmates are locked in their cells and would have to walk past me to get to the shower. I'm the only CO on the block as well. I get scared and refuse to turn around to look. This continues to happen off and on any time I am on that unit at night. Not every single time, but definitely more than once. I've also seen the bottom of misty black legs walking on the top tier, and when I looked up directly at it, nothing was there. On another unit one night, I hear what sounds like walking coming up to the CO bubble, turn my head, and no one is there. On multiple occasions, I also saw something moving in the corner of my eye. Like a black figure that is only there for a split second. I used to work at a retirement home that had 3 different levels of support for the tenants. Level 1 was known as household care. This was for seniors who could more or less live entirely by themselves. This building was more or less an apartment building, with cleaners coming by to perform light housekeeping and laundry for the tenants every day. Level 1 also had a dining hall where tenants could come for daily meals if they didn't want to cook their own. This is where I worked, as a waiter for the dining hall. Level 2 was for seniors who needed a bit more personal care. They often had a companion who helped them with shopping, doctor's appointments, medication, and generally kept them company throughout the day. Oftentimes, a lot of people from level 1 would be moved over to level 2 as they got older and needed some further support. There was still a level of independence, but she was leaning pretty strongly towards a nursing home. Level 3 was for patients who needed consistent 24/7 care, most often due to medical conditions. Level 3 was essentially a hospital and was fully staffed with nurses and workers to help seniors get dressed, bathe them, etc. It was a fair bit more isolated than the rest of the buildings, and you were never to go over there unless specifically instructed. Now, this place was a fair bit more upscale than most other retirement homes, and as such, it was built like an absolute fortress. Enough backup generator power for a solid month or more, enough non-perishable foodstuffs for staff and tenants to last ages, and pretty large underground flood-resistant shelters. We lived in a town right beside a massive river. Flooding was awfully common. Now, each level of care is in an entirely different building on the same property, each one being about a 3 to 4 minute walk away. However, they had built these massive underground paths that connect each building in case a tenant needed to be rushed to level 3 for emergency medical care. They were pretty long, all concrete with carpeted floors. Honestly, it was kind of neat how this place was laid out, and I was pretty curious on my first few days. On one of our first days during orientation, we were shown the majority of level 1 and a little bit of the underground shelters and pathways. Once the tour was over, being as curious as I was, I asked my instructor if I could take a look around some of the underground paths and around level 2 a little bit. She obliged and told me some of the easier routes to get around and such. The closest route down into the underground system was through an elevator near the laundry room on the first floor. I took it down, and it immediately took me to the path between level 1 and level 2. It was essentially one gigantically long, poorly lit hallway deep underground. Fun stuff. As the paths weren't used very often, they had these motion-activated lights that flickered on one by one as you walked down the hallway. I made my way down to the end of the hallway, where the elevator up to level 2 was. There were a few small bench-like seats just outside the elevators, likely so that the seniors could have a place to rest for a second while waiting for their elevators. As I got to the second end, there was this quite tall-looking older gentleman sitting on the bench with his caretaker beside him. We were always told to be as friendly and respectful to the seniors in the building as possible, as they really wanted to emphasize the place as a new home rather than just a retirement center. I was talking to both of them and introducing myself when we heard the elevator ding on the other side of the hallway, the side coming down from level 1. We both took a glance over and started to see the first light come on, indicating that somebody was heading down the hallway. We kept chatting, but noticed that the first light stayed on for quite some time. After a good minute or two, eventually the second light turned on, and the first light shut off a second or two later. The caretaker and I assumed that a senior with less mobility may have made their way down and was slowly making their way down the hallway. I offered to go and meet the tenant to see if I could help walk them down to the other end. As I made my way to the other end, though, I couldn't make out or see anybody in the hallway. Usually, people stand out like sore thumbs due to essentially having a spotlight cast on them. When I was just about halfway through the hallway, the third light puttered on and the second light turned off shortly after. Still no sign of anybody at all in the hallway. I started slowing down my pace a little bit and started to get a serious case of the heebie-jeebies. Almost immediately after I started slowing down, the fourth light came on, and the third went out. Seconds later, the fifth came on, and only a second or two later, the sixth turned on. I stopped completely and looked back at the two on the other side, and I could only assume they shared my mutual expression of WTF. The whole while, the lights kept turning on one after another, and they started to speed up. This was the point where I started to get a serious case of the nopes and started walking at a considerable pace back to the level 2 elevator. The lights kept flicking on behind me, and they started to get fast. The lights behind couldn't keep up with turning off, and at times, huge parts of the hallway were entirely illuminated. The lights stopped probably about 2/3 RDS of the way to the level 2 elevator, but by that point I was already getting back to the caretaker and the gentleman. Both of them looked a little confused and spooked, but the poor man looked scared half to death. It was the look when you're trying not to show that you're scared, but in reality, you're dead afraid. The caretaker tried to lighten the mood and laugh it off as faulty older wiring, but the facility was fairly new and extremely well maintained. We took the elevator up to level 2, and I more than happily took the garden path outside to get back rather than go back under. Even thinking about it still gives me some mad goosebumps.